Some stories come to us not because we seek them, but because they have been waiting in the quiet places where loneliness and hope share the same breath. This is such a story. It comes from a time when the West was still wild, when a man could build his home on the edge of a cliff and call it sanctuary, when a woman could arrive on a dusty train platform with nothing but a canvas bag and a heart full of questions she had stopped asking aloud. I first heard this tale from an old carpenter in Ridgewood, Montana, many years ago. He sat on his porch in the evening light, hands rough as oak bark, and spoke of a lumberjack who lived where the pines touched the sky. The carpenter said some loves are born in silence, some homes are found in the strangest places. I have carried this story with me ever since. Now I share it with you, because I reckon you might need it. Because somewhere, in every heart, there is a house on a cliff waiting for someone brave enough to stay. The fourth woman stepped off the train at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon in September. Elias Harwick saw her from across the platform. He had positioned himself near the water tower, far enough to observe without being observed. A habit born from 3 previous failures. 3 women who had traveled hundreds of miles to meet him, only to turn back before the week was out. She was not what he expected. The advertisement he had placed in the Matrimonial Gazette had been honest to a fault. Lumberjack, 34 seeks wife, remote location, hard work, must not fear heights. The words had felt inadequate even as he wrote them. How do you explain a house that hangs between earth and sky? How do you warn someone about the loneliness that seeps into your bones like morning fog? The woman stood on the platform, a single canvas bag at her feet. Her dress was calico, faded to the color of dried tobacco leaves. Practical. Her boots showed wear at the heels, the kind that came from walking, not riding. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back severely and a face that revealed nothing. The platform smelled of coal smoke and machine oil, the sharp tang of iron wheels cooling on the tracks. A porter wheeled a cart of luggage past, the wooden wheels grinding against the worn planks. Somewhere down the line, a conductor called out departure times, his voice thin and distant in the September heat. Elias straightened his coat and walked toward her. "Mrs. Callahan." She did not respond. Her eyes moved across the platform, past him, as if searching for someone else. "Mrs. Callahan," he repeated, louder this time. Still nothing. She turned her head slightly, and for a moment their eyes met. Hers were gray, the color of river stones after rain. She looked at him the way a person looks at a horizon, measuring distance. Old Pete, the station agent, shuffled over. He had watched this scene play out 3 times before. "That's her. Elias, the mail order lady." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "She's deaf, though. Can't hear a lick." "Didn't nobody tell you deaf?" The words settled into Elias like a stone dropped into still water. He looked at her again. She had not moved, had not flinched when Pete spoke about her as if she were not standing 3 feet away. She simply waited, her hands folded in front of her, patient as a saint carved in wood, still as stone, unmoving, like she had learned long ago that the world would talk around her whether she listened or not. Elias removed his hat. He stepped directly into her line of sight, made sure she could see his face clearly, and pointed to himself. "Elias Harwick," he said slowly, exaggerating the movement of his lips. She studied him. Then she reached into her bag and withdrew a small notebook and pencil. Her handwriting was precise, each letter formed with care. I am Clara. I received your letter. I know about the house. He read the words twice. The women before her had known about the house too, in theory, but knowing and seeing were different things. Margaret, the first one, had wept at the base of the mountain and refused to climb further. Dorothy had made it to the door, taken one look at the drop below the porch, and demanded to be taken back immediately. Sarah had stayed one night, leaving at dawn with the horse he had borrowed to fetch her. Clara held out another note. The agent told me you live where eagles nest. I am not afraid of heights. I am afraid of other things. Elias read it and looked up. She was watching his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Not staring. Exactly. Reading. The way a person reads a book they are not sure they will like, but have committed to finishing. He took the pencil from her hand and wrote beneath her words. What things? She took back the notebook, but did not answer. Instead, she picked up her bag and nodded toward the road, where his buckboard waited. The wagon's this way, he said, then remembered she could not hear him. He pointed. She walked ahead of him without hesitation. The road to Elias's property wound through 7 miles of forest before it began to climb. The pines grew thick here, ponderosa giants that blocked the sun and filled the air with the sharp scent of resin. Elias had made this journey hundreds of times. He knew every rut, every boulder, every place where the trail narrowed to a single wagon's width. He drove in silence. She sat beside him in silence. But this silence was different from the ones he was accustomed to. His silence was the absence of sound. Hers was something else entirely. A presence rather than a void. The forest spoke around them in ways she would never hear: the chatter of a squirrel defending its territory high in the branches, the distant knock of a woodpecker drilling into dead bark, the rush of Pine Creek somewhere below them in the ravine. A jay screamed its warning as they passed, and a doe lifted her head from a patch of wild clover before bounding into the shadows. Twice he caught himself starting to speak. Old habits. He had talked to his horses for years, to the trees, to the empty rooms of his house. Sound had become his companion when human company failed him. Now sound was useless. At the creek crossing, Elias stopped to water the horses. Clara climbed down without assistance and walked to the water's edge. She knelt on a flat rock and cupped the cold water in her hands, drinking from her palms like a child. When she rose, she was looking at him differently. He did not know how to name it. Not warmth, not yet. But the suspicion had faded. She took out her notebook. You handle the horses gently. They trust you. He read the note and felt something shift in his chest. A loosening he had not expected. They're good animals, he wrote back. Better company than most folks. A faint smile crossed her face. Gone as quickly as it came. I understand, she wrote. The last mile was the hardest. The trail turned steep, switching back on itself as it climbed the ridge. Below them, the valley spread out like a green ocean frozen in time. Above them, granite cliffs rose toward the clouds. Elias watched Clara from the corner of his eye. This was the place where Margaret had started crying, where Dorothy had grabbed the seat rail so hard her knuckles went white. Clara looked down at the valley. Then she looked up at the cliffs. Then she looked at his hands on the reins, steady and sure. She sat back in her seat and folded her hands in her lap. The buckboard rounded the final bend, and the house came into view. It was exactly as strange as he had built it to be. A cabin of hand-hewn pine logs, perched on a granite ledge that jutted out from the mountainside like a pointing finger. The front porch hung over empty air, 300 feet below. The treetops swayed in a wind that never stopped blowing at this height. Elias pulled the horses to a stop. He did not look at Clara. He could not. Instead, he looked at his house, trying to see it through a stranger's eyes. The impossibility of it. The madness. A touch on his arm. She was holding out her notebook. "You built this yourself?" He nodded. "Every timber, every nail." He nodded again. She wrote one more line, then handed him the notebook and climbed down from the wagon. "Show me inside." The interior was sparse. A main room with a cook stove. A table he had built from fallen oak. 2 chairs. A smaller room in the back with a bed frame and a mattress stuffed with dried grass. Windows on 3 walls, letting in light that seemed to come from the sky itself. Clara moved through the space slowly. She touched everything. The walls, the window frames, the joints where timber met timber. Her fingers traced the dovetails he had cut by hand, the pegs he had shaped from hickory because nails rusted and wood endured. She stopped at the front window, the one that looked out over the valley, over the void. Elias waited. He had learned to wait. Waiting was all you could do when the world kept saying no. Clara turned to face him. The afternoon light caught her eyes and turned them silver. She reached for her notebook, wrote something, tore out the page, and placed it in his hand. Then she walked to the back room, set her bag on the floor beside the bed, and closed the door. Elias looked at the note. "Which room is mine?" He read it 5 times. His hands. Those hands that could fell a tree with 20 strokes. That could shape a beam so true it needed no shimming. Those hands were trembling. He had not expected her to stay. No one stayed. But there was her bag, sitting on his floor. There was the closed door between them. There was this woman who could not hear the wind howling through the canyon or the creak of timber settling in the cold, who could only see what her eyes showed her. And her eyes, it seemed, had shown her something worth staying for. Elias folded the note carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, against his heart. Then he went outside to tend the horses because he did not know what else to do, and because some feelings are too large to hold inside 4 walls, even walls you built yourself. The sun was setting behind the mountains. The sky burned red and gold, the colors of forge fire, of autumn leaves, of things ending and things beginning. Somewhere inside the cabin. Clara was unpacking her bag. The 4th woman had decided to stay. Some folks say home is where you hang your hat. Others say it is where they have to take you in. But I have come to believe home is simpler than that. It is the place where someone chooses to stay, even when leaving would be easier. If this story has touched your heart, I would be grateful if you would leave a like and follow along for the next chapter. And if you have a moment, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It does my soul good to know these old tales still find willing ears. The horses knew the way. Elias let the reins go slack and watched their ears swivel toward familiar sounds, the rush of Pine Creek below, the chatter of a squirrel defending its territory, the distant knock of a woodpecker drilling into dead bark. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-warmed granite. Clara sat beside him with her hands in her lap, still as stone. He had never met anyone who could hold such stillness, even in sleep. Most folks shifted and twitched. She seemed carved from the same granite that held his house. 2 hours into the climb, she reached into her bag and withdrew a piece of dried apple. She broke it in half without looking at him and held out her palm. He took it. The fruit was leathery and sweet. the kind you dried on racks in late summer when the wasps came thick. His mother had made them this way, a lifetime ago, before the fever took her and everyone else. The memory rose unbidden, the smell of apple slices browning in the September sun, his sister Emma sneaking pieces when she thought no one was watching. Clara chewed slowly. Her jaw moved in that measured way that told him she was thinking, turning something over in her mind the way a prospector turns a stone. She reached for her notebook. "Why do you live so high?" He read the words and did not answer immediately. The question had an obvious answer: the timber rights, the solitude. The fact that nobody bothered a man who lived where only eagles and mountain goats could follow. But those were reasons, not truths. He took the pencil. Because nobody else wanted to. She read it, nodded once, wrote again. That is not an answer. He felt something pull at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile. It's the only one I have. The trail narrowed where it crossed the granite shelf, barely wide enough for the wagon wheels. On the right, the mountain rose in a sheer wall of gray stone. On the left, nothing but air and a long fall to the creek below. The first woman, Margaret, had screamed at this point, had clutched his arm so hard she left bruises. Clara leaned forward and looked over the edge. Her body tilted toward the void as casually as if she were examining flowers in a garden. The wind caught a strand of her hair and pulled it loose from its pins. She sat back. Her face showed nothing. No fear, no relief. Just that same measuring look she had given him at the station. She wrote one word and held it up. Beautiful. Elias stared at the paper, at the simple letters, at the woman who had written them while sitting 3 feet from a 300-foot drop. The horses plodded on. The sun moved across the sky, and Elias found himself wondering, for the first time in years, what a woman like this could possibly be running from. The cabin clung to the granite ledge like a living thing, refusing to let go. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop where the trail ended and the rock began. The horses stamped and blew, eager to be unhitched. He set the brake and climbed down, his boots finding the familiar grooves worn into the stone over 7 years of coming and going. Clara remained seated. She was looking at the house, not with the wide-eyed horror Margaret had shown, not with Dorothy's trembling lip, not with Sarah's calculating gaze that had already been planning her escape. Clara looked at the house the way a person looks at something they have been searching for without knowing it existed. The structure jutted out over empty air. Elias had built the foundation on granite anchors he had drilled himself, filling the holes with molten lead and iron pins until the wood and stone became one. The front porch extended 6 feet beyond the cliff edge. Standing on it, you could drop a stone and count to 4 before it hit the treetops below. He walked around to her side of the wagon and held up his hand. She ignored it, climbed down on her own. Her boots hit the stone with a solid sound. The wind was stronger here. It always was. It came up the canyon in steady gusts, carrying the scent of pine resin and distant water. Clara's hair pulled loose from its pins, dark strands whipping across her face. She did not push them back. She walked toward the house. Elias followed 3 paces behind. The key to the front door hung on a leather cord around his neck. He had never needed to lock it. Nobody came up here, but the habit remained from another life, another house, another time when locks mattered. Clara stopped at the edge of the porch. The boards creaked under her weight as she tested them with one foot, then the other. She looked down through the gaps between the planks. The void yawned beneath her, blue-gray and endless. She stepped forward. The porch held. It always held. He had built it to hold a team of horses if needed. But watching her walk across those suspended boards, he found his hands clenching at his sides. She reached the door and turned to face him, waiting. He pulled the cord over his head, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The smell of cold ash and cedar greeted them. He had banked the stove before leaving 3 days ago, and the chill had crept back in. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of light from the doorway. Beneath the cedar, there was the faint sweetness of the dried herbs he kept hanging from the rafters: sage and rosemary and wild mint. Clara entered. She moved through the main room with the same deliberate pace she had used on the porch. Her fingers brushed the table he had built from a fallen oak struck by lightning. She examined the joints where he had fitted the legs without glue, relying only on the precision of the cut. Her palm pressed flat against the log wall, feeling the texture of bark he had stripped and sanded smooth. The cook stove drew her attention, a cast-iron beast he had hauled up the mountain in pieces, reassembling it over 3 days of cursing and burned fingers. She opened the firebox door, peered inside at the cold gray ash, closed it again. The window above the dry sink looked east toward the sunrise. She stood there for a long moment, her reflection ghosting in the wavy glass. Elias stayed near the door. He had learned from the others. Better to let them explore. Better to let them find their own reasons to leave rather than trying to convince them to stay. Clara turned from the window and crossed to the back room. The door was open. Inside, the bed frame he had built from pine poles and the mattress stuffed with dried meadow grass, a small chest for clothes, a mirror he had salvaged from a broken wardrobe in town, still showing the crack that ran from corner to corner. She entered the room, ran her hand along the bed frame, testing the joints, pressed down on the mattress, watching how it gave and returned. The floorboards were cold beneath her boots. He could see the way she shifted her weight, feeling the chill seep up through the worn leather soles. Then she did something none of the others had done. She sat down on the bed. The ropes beneath the mattress creaked. The frame held solid. She looked around the small space at the window that faced the sunset, at the pegs driven into the wall for hanging clothes, at the rough plank floor she would walk across every morning and every night. Elias waited in the doorway. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook. She wrote something, tore the page free, and held it out to him. He crossed the room, took the paper. Read it. The women before me. Why did they leave? His throat tightened. He had expected questions about water, about food, about how they would survive up here when the trails became impassable. Not this. He sat down on the chest across from her. The wood groaned under his weight. He took the pencil and wrote slowly, choosing each word. Margaret was afraid of the height. Dorothy was afraid of the isolation. Sarah was afraid of me. Clara read the note. Her face did not change. She wrote back, "Were they right to be afraid of you?" The question hung in the air between them. The light through the window had turned amber as the sun dropped toward the peaks. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room. Elias looked at his hands, the calluses across his palms, the scars on his knuckles, the nail on his left thumb that had grown back crooked after he smashed it with a mallet. Working hands, building hands, hands that had never struck a woman, never raised against anyone in anger. But Sarah had looked at these hands and seen something else. Something that made her pack her bag in the dark and walk 5 miles down the mountain rather than spend another night under his roof. He wrote his answer. "I don't know what Sarah saw. I only know what I am." Clara studied the words. Then she reached out and took his hand. The contact was sudden and deliberate. Her fingers were cool and dry. She turned his palm upward and traced the calluses with her thumb. The lifeline. The heart line. The rough ridges where axes and saws had worn their marks into his flesh. She released him and wrote, "A man who builds things. That is what I see." Elias read it 3 times. The tightness in his throat spread to his chest. She stood and placed her bag on the floor beside the bed. Then she pointed to the main room and made a gesture he understood without translation. "I'm hungry." He rose and went to the stove. The routine of making fire saved him. Kindling from the box beside the hearth, shavings he had curled from cedar with his belt knife, the strike of flint on steel, the spark catching, the careful feeding of larger sticks until the flames took hold. The smell of wood smoke filled the cabin, familiar and grounding. Clara watched from the doorway. Her face glowed orange in the firelight. He set the coffee pot to heat and retrieved the beans from the larder, a small cabinet he had built into the north wall where the rock kept things cool. Salt pork, hard biscuits, a jar of honey he had traded for in town. Simple fare, survival food. She did not complain, did not wrinkle her nose at the plain meal the way Dorothy had. When he handed her a tin plate, she took it and sat at the table across from him. They ate in silence. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. The wind moaned around the corners of the house, a low sound like someone humming a tune they had forgotten the words to. Outside, the sky turned purple, then black, and the first stars emerged like pinpricks in a dark curtain. Clara finished her food and set down her fork. She reached for her notebook. "The wind sounds loud." Elias blinked. Then he remembered she could not hear it. She was reading his face, watching the way his eyes moved toward the walls when a particularly strong gust hit. He wrote back, "You can feel it." She placed her palm flat on the table. He did the same. Through the wood, through the joints and beams. He felt what she felt, the faint vibration that ran through the entire structure when the wind pushed against it. The house breathed. It swayed imperceptibly, like a tree that bends rather than breaks. "The house moves," she wrote, "but it does not fall. It was built to move," he answered. "Rigid things break, flexible things survive." She read his words and something shifted in her expression. The first softening in that careful face. Not quite a smile, but something close. Something that looked almost like recognition. She stood and gathered the plates. He started to rise, to help, but she waved him back down. At the dry sink, she poured water from the pitcher into the basin and began to wash. Her movements were efficient, practiced the movements of someone who had washed 1,000 plates in 1,000 different kitchens. Elias watched her work, the economy of her movements, no wasted motion, the way she stacked the clean plates in the same order he kept them, the way she wiped down the table without being asked, using the rag that hung from the hook beside the sink. When she finished, she dried her hands and wrote one more note, "Good night." Then she walked to the back room and closed the door behind her. Elias sat alone at the table. The fire had burned down to coals, casting red light across the walls. He should bank it for the night, should check the horses one more time, should do any of the dozen things that filled his evenings. Instead, he sat. The note she had written earlier was still in his shirt pocket. "Which room is mine?" He pulled it out and read it again. The paper was soft from his body heat, the ink slightly smudged. She was staying. He did not understand why. The height had not frightened her. The isolation had not concerned her. The question about Sarah had not sent her running. Were they right to be afraid of you? He folded the note and returned it to his pocket. Outside, an owl called two low hoots followed by silence. Inside, through the thin wall, he heard the creak of ropes as Clara settled onto the bed. He sat there until the coals turned to ash and the cold crept back into the room. Then he rose, banked the stove, and pulled his bedroll from the corner where he kept it. The main room floor was hard, but he had slept on worse. He lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe around him. The wind had died down, leaving only the small sounds of settling wood and distant water. From the back room, nothing. No tossing, no whimpering, no stifled sobs. Just the deep silence of someone sleeping without dreams. He closed his eyes. 3 women had come before her. 3 women had looked at this house, at this life, at him, and found something wanting, something broken, something frightening. Clara had looked at the same things and seen a man who builds. What had she seen that the others had missed? Or the thought came unbidden, sharp as a blade. What had she failed to see that would send her running too? The smell of coffee woke him. Elias opened his eyes to gray light filtering through the windows. His back ached from the hard floor, and his neck had stiffened during the night. He pushed himself up on one elbow and blinked at the figure moving near the stove. Clara stood with her back to him, pouring steaming water into the tin coffee pot. She had dressed already the same faded calico from yesterday, but her hair was wet at the ends, freshly washed. She must have found the rain barrel on the north side of the house. He sat up. The bedroll rustled. She turned. No surprise on her face. She had known he was awake. Perhaps from the vibration of his movement through the floorboards, perhaps from the change in the quality of stillness in the room. She pointed to the table. A plate sat waiting. Hard biscuits split and toasted on the stovetop, spread with the honey from his larder. Steam rose from a tin cup. Elias folded his bedroll and stowed it in the corner. He splashed water on his face from the basin she had filled. Cold, bracing. The shock of it drove the last fog of sleep from his mind. He sat at the table. Clara sat across from him with her own plate, her own cup. They ate in silence. The coffee was strong, stronger than he made it. The biscuits were warm, and the honey had soaked into them, sweetening each bite. When he finished, he reached for the notebook that lay between them. "You didn't have to do this." She read it and wrote back without hesitation. "I live here now. I do my share." He read the words twice. "I live here now." 4 words that rearranged everything he thought he understood about the days ahead. She tapped the table to get his attention and wrote again. "What work do you do today?" He thought about the timber he had been felling on the north slope, the logs that needed to be stripped and dragged to the mill site, the chair he had started for a merchant in town who was paying $2 for the finished piece. "Cutting timber," he wrote, then finishing a chair. "Show me." He looked at her. Her gray eyes held steady on his face. "It's hard work," he wrote. "Not for..." She took the pencil from his hand before he could finish, drew a single line through his words, wrote beneath it, "Show me." The north slope lay a quarter-mile from the house, accessible by a trail he had cut through the underbrush over years of use. Elias carried his axe over one shoulder and a coil of rope over the other. Clara walked behind him, her boots finding solid purchase on the uneven ground. The forest closed around them, filtering the morning light into shafts of gold and green. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. The rich loam of a forest floor that had been building for centuries. Somewhere above, a woodpecker hammered at a dead trunk, the sound echoing through the trees like a rapid heartbeat. The pines here grew tall and straight, their lower branches dying off as they reached for light. Perfect timber. He had been working this stand for 3 seasons, taking only what he needed, leaving the younger trees to grow. He stopped at a tree he had marked the week before, a chalk X on the bark at eye level. The trunk was 2 feet across, the wood inside dense and close-grained. It would make good planks for the furniture he sold in town. Clara stood back and watched as he positioned himself. The axe handle was smooth from years of use, the steel head sharp enough to shave with. He had honed it that morning while she was washing. The first swing bit into the bark with a solid thunk. Chips flew, pale against the dark forest floor. He pulled back, swung again. The rhythm took over the coiling of muscle, the release, the impact, the recovery. He had felled 1,000 trees this way. His body knew the motion the way his lungs knew breathing. Sweat broke across his forehead. His shoulders burned. The notch deepened, bite by bite, until he had cut 1/3 of the way through. The smell of fresh-cut pine filled the air, sharp and clean, mixing with the salt of his own sweat. He stopped to rest, wiped his face with his sleeve. Clara had moved to his left. She pointed to the axe, then to herself. He shook his head. She stepped forward and held out her hands. The axe was heavy, 8 pounds of steel and hickory. He had seen grown men struggle with it. But she stood there with her hands extended, waiting. And something in her expression told him she would not move until he gave her what she asked for. He handed her the axe. She hefted it, tested the balance, adjusted her grip the way a person does who has held tools before. Then she positioned herself at the notch he had started, planted her feet, and swung. The blade glanced off the wood at an angle, sending chips flying sideways. She staggered slightly from the recoil. Elias stepped forward. He stood behind her and placed his hands over hers on the handle. The position brought him close enough to smell the rainwater in her hair, the faint soap scent of her skin. He guided her through the motion. Slow at first. The lift, the coil, the release. She could not hear his instructions, so he let his body teach hers. The angle of the swing, the snap of the wrists at the moment of impact, the follow-through that kept the blade from binding in the cut. She tried again. Better this time. The blade bit clean, throwing a curl of pale wood. Again. Deeper. Again. By the 10th swing, her face was flushed and her arms were trembling. But the notch had grown by 3 inches, and the cuts were clean. Sawdust clung to her forearms, and a streak of pine sap gleamed on her cheek. She handed the axe back to him. Her palms were red where the handle had pressed against soft skin. Tomorrow they would blister. In a week, if she kept at it, calluses would begin to form. She took out her notebook. Her handwriting was shakier than before, the letters uneven from tired muscles. My father was a carpenter. Before, Elias read the words. Before that single word carrying the weight of everything she was not saying. Before what he wrote. She looked at the paper for a long moment. Then she closed the notebook and tucked it back into her pocket without answering. The afternoon passed in work. Elias felled the tree while Clara watched from a safe distance. The crack of splitting wood, the slow lean, the gathering rush as gravity took hold. She could not hear any of it, but she felt the ground shake when the trunk hit. Her eyes went wide for just an instant before the careful blankness returned. They stripped the branches together. She learned quickly, using the hatchet he gave her to chop the smaller limbs while he took the larger ones with his axe. The smell of pine sap grew thick around them, sticky and sweet. By the time the shadows grew long, the trunk lay clean and bare, ready to be sectioned and hauled. Walking back to the house, Clara stopped at a patch of wild onions growing in a clearing. She knelt and began to dig, loosening the soil with her fingers, pulling the bulbs free with their green shoots still attached. The earth was dark and crumbly, rich with the scent of growing things. Elias watched her work. The care she took with each plant, the way she shook the dirt from the roots before placing them in her apron pocket. At the house, she washed the onions in the rain barrel and carried them inside. He followed and found her already at work, chopping the bulbs on the cutting board he had made from a single slab of maple. She cooked supper. Salt pork fried with the wild onions, beans from a jar, more of the hard biscuits softened in the pan drippings. The smell filled the cabin, rich and savory, reminding him of meals he had not eaten since childhood. They ate as the last light faded from the windows. Elias found himself watching her hands as she lifted the fork to her mouth. The red marks from the axe handle had deepened. She flexed her fingers between bites, working out the stiffness. He reached across the table and took her hand before he could think better of it. She went still. He turned her palm upward, examining the damage. The skin was abraded, but not broken. No blisters yet, but they would come. He released her and stood, crossing to the shelf where he kept his supplies, a small tin of tallow mixed with beeswax. He had made it himself for treating leather, but it worked on skin too. He sat back down and held out the tin. She looked at it, looked at him, then she extended her hands, palms up. He scooped a small amount of the salve onto his fingers. The tallow was soft from the warmth of the cabin, slick and faintly sweet-smelling. He worked it into her palms with his thumbs, pressing gently against the reddened skin. Her hands were smaller than his, the fingers tapered and strong, calluses on her fingertips, old ones, from needlework, perhaps, or from whatever work she had done before she boarded a train to answer a stranger's advertisement. When he finished, he released her hands and pushed the tin across the table. "Use this morning and night," he wrote. "The calluses will come faster." She read the note and nodded. Then she wrote something and slid the paper to him. "Thank you for teaching me." He looked at the words, at her face in the lamplight. The careful blankness had softened into something else. Not warmth, exactly, but the beginning of trust. "You learn fast," he wrote back. "I have to," she answered. "I have spent my life learning to survive without sound. Everything else is easier by comparison." The days found a rhythm. Mornings. They worked the timber together. She grew stronger with the hatchet, her swings more confident, her aim more true. The blisters came and broke and hardened into the pale yellow calluses that marked a working life. Afternoons. Elias shaped the chair while Clara watched. She sat on a stool near his workbench, her notebook in her lap, writing questions that he answered between cuts. Why do you use pegs instead of nails? Nails rust. Wood endures. Why do you cut the joints at that angle? So the weight pushes them tighter together instead of pulling them apart. She absorbed everything, not just watching, but understanding. He saw it in the way she examined each piece before he assembled it, running her fingers along the joints, feeling how they fit. The workshop smelled of fresh shavings and linseed oil, the honest smell of work being done right. On the 5th day, she asked to try. He handed her the spokes halve, showed her how to hold it, how to angle the blade, how to read the grain so the tool cut smooth instead of tearing. She practiced on a scrap piece, shaving long curls of wood that fell to the floor around her feet like ribbons. Her first attempts were rough, gouges where she pressed too hard, ridges where she changed angle mid-stroke. But she did not stop, did not grow frustrated, just kept working, adjusting, learning. By the end of the week, she could shape a spindle clean enough to pass his inspection. He gave her the second chair to finish. They worked side by side at the bench, the only sounds the scrape of tools and the whisper of wood shavings. She could not hear him, but she matched his rhythm anyway. The push and pull of the spokes halve, the tap of mallet on chisel, the rasp of sandpaper smoothing rough edges. When the chairs were done, he loaded them into the wagon for the trip to town. Clara came with him for the first time. The merchant, a red-faced man named Hoskins, examined the chairs with a critical eye. He ran his hands over the joints, tested the strength of the legs, sat in each one and shifted his weight. "Fine work," he said finally. "Same as always?" He counted out 4 silver dollars and placed them on the counter. Clara stood near the door, watching the exchange. Hoskins glanced at her, then back at Elias. "New wife?" Elias nodded. "The deaf one Pete at the station told me about her." Hoskins lowered his voice, though the gesture was meaningless. "She simple, too?" Elias felt his jaw tighten. "She finished the second chair, the one you're sitting in." Hoskins blinked, looked down at the chair beneath him, looked back at Clara, who stood with her hands folded, her face revealing nothing. "Well," he said, "I'll be—" The ride back was quiet. Clara sat beside him on the wagon seat, her share of the money, 2 silver dollars tucked into her pocket. He had pressed the coins into her hand over her protests, closing her fingers around them when she tried to give them back. "You earned it," he had written. "The work was yours." She had looked at the money for a long time. Then she had slipped it into her pocket without another word. Now, as the wagon climbed the trail toward home, she took out her notebook. What did he say about me, the merchant? Elias kept his eyes on the road. She could read lips when folks faced her. But Hoskins had turned away. She had seen enough to know something was said. Not enough to know what. He could lie. Tell her Hoskins had complimented her work. But the thought curdled in his stomach before it fully formed. He took the pencil. He asked if you were simple. "Because you are deaf." She read the words. Her face did not change. "What did you tell him that you made the chair he was sitting in?" A pause. Then she wrote, "And he believed you. He had no choice." The work spoke for itself. She looked at the paper for a long moment. Then she did something he had never seen her do. She laughed. No sound came with it. Her shoulders shook and her mouth opened, and her eyes crinkled at the corners. But the laugh itself lived only in the movement of her body. A silent joy that he could see, but not hear. She wrote again, her hand trembling slightly from the laughter still rippling through her. "I reckon I will make many chairs, until the whole town sits on my work and cannot say I am simple." Elias read it and felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that had been closed so long he had forgotten it existed. He wrote back, "I would mighty like to see that." That night, after supper, Clara did not go directly to her room. She sat at the table while Elias cleaned the plates. When he finished and turned around, she was holding something in her hands, a small object, wrapped in cloth. She set it on the table and unwrapped it slowly. A mirror, small, round, with a wooden frame carved in a pattern of leaves. The glass was cracked across one corner, but the rest was clear. She pushed it toward him. "I found this in your back room," she wrote. "In the chest." There were other things too. A wooden horse. A doll made of cloth. Elias's hands went still on the edge of the table. "Did you make these?" He did not answer. Could not. The air in the cabin had grown thick, pressing against his chest. Clara waited. Patient as always. She did not push, did not write another question, just sat with her hands folded, giving him the space to speak or stay silent. He picked up the mirror. The frame was smooth under his fingers, worn from handling. He had carved it 12 years ago. In another house. In another life. Before the fever. Before the silence that had nothing to do with sound. Yes, he wrote finally, "I made them." For whom the pencil trembled in his grip. He set it down. Picked it up again. "My sister?" She was 7 when she died. Clara read the words. Her face softened in a way he had not seen before. Not pity, he would have hated pity, but something else. Recognition. Understanding. She wrote slowly, each letter deliberate. "I had a brother. He was 9. The scarlet fever took him the same year it took my hearing." Elias stared at the paper, at the words that mirrored his own loss so closely, it felt like looking into the cracked glass of the mirror. "You were sick too, yes. He died. I lived, but part of me went with him." She paused, then added one more line. "The part that could hear." The lamp flickered. Outside. The wind had risen, pressing against the walls of the cabin. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, punctuating the silence with small sounds of comfort. But inside, in the circle of yellow light, everything had gone very still. Elias looked at Clara, at this woman who had arrived with a canvas bag and a notebook, who had learned to swing an axe and shape a spindle, who sat now in his kitchen with his dead sister's mirror in front of her. She had lost something too, not just her hearing. A brother, a life, a version of herself that existed only in memory. He reached across the table and took her hand. She did not pull away. They sat like that for a spell. 2 people who had learned to live with absence, discovering that silence could be shared. When she finally rose to go to bed, she left the mirror on the table. In the morning, Elias found it hanging on a nail beside the kitchen window, positioned to catch the first light of dawn. She had not asked permission. He found that he did not mind. The chest sat in the corner of the back room like a sealed grave. Elias had not opened it in 7 years, had shoved it against the wall when he first built the cabin and piled blankets on top as if the weight could keep the past from escaping. But Clara had found it, had lifted the lid while he was out checking the horses, had touched the things inside with her careful, questioning hands. He did not blame her. She had not known. But now the chest stood open, its contents exposed to the afternoon light slanting through the window. The wooden horse he had carved for Emma's 5th birthday. The cloth doll their mother had sewn from scraps of a worn-out dress. A ribbon, faded from red to rust. a small Bible with Emma's name written inside the cover in their father's careful script. Clara sat on the bed, watching him. He had come into the room to fetch a clean shirt and stopped in the doorway. His feet would not move forward. His hands hung at his sides, useless. She rose and crossed to him, took his hand and led him to the bed, pressing gently on his shoulders until he sat. Then she knelt beside the chest and began to lift each item, one by one, holding them up for him to see. The horse first. She turned it in her hands, examining the carved mane, the notched hooves, the worn spot on the neck, where small fingers had gripped it through countless imaginary rides. "You made this," she wrote. Not a question. He nodded. "It is beautiful." She set the horse on the bed beside him and reached for the doll. The fabric had faded, and the button eyes hung loose on their threads. One arm was coming unstitched at the shoulder. The doll smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the scent of years spent in darkness. "Your mother made this?" Another nod. His throat had closed. He could not have spoken, even if she could hear. Clara held the doll against her chest for a moment. The way by a child holds something precious. Then she laid it gently beside the horse. The ribbon, the Bible, a lock of hair tied with string, so pale it was almost white. She did not ask about the hair. Some things needed no explanation. When the chest was empty, she closed the lid and sat beside him on the bed. The items lay between them, like relics from another lifetime, evidence of lives that had ended too soon. She took out her notebook. "Tell me about her." Elias stared at the words. No one had asked him about Emma since the funeral. The neighbors had offered condolences. The preacher had spoken of heaven. But no one had wanted to hear about the girl herself, as if speaking of the dead might summon them back, as if grief was catching, like the fever that caused it. He picked up the pencil, set it down, picked it up again. She was afraid of storms. He wrote, "But she loved the rain. She would stand at the window and watch it fall, as long as there was no thunder." Clara read and waited. She wanted to learn to whittle. I was going to teach her. We never got the chance. The pencil moved across the paper, slow at first, then faster, words he had never written, never spoken, words that had lived inside him for 12 years, pressing against his ribs like prisoners against bars. She used to sing when she thought no one was listening. Little songs she made up, about birds and flowers, and the cat that lived in the barn. She was afraid of the dark, but pretended not to be. I would hear her talking to herself at night, telling stories to keep the fear away. She believed in angels, said she could see them sometimes, in the clouds. I told her she was imagining things. I wish I hadn't. The notebook page filled. He turned to a fresh one and kept writing. The fever took her in 3 days. She was fine on Monday. By Thursday, she was gone. I was 15. I thought I was supposed to protect her. I couldn't protect anyone. Our parents died the next week. First mother, then father. The doctor said some folks have no resistance. The fever just burns through them. I buried them myself. All 3. The ground was so hard I broke 2 shovels. He stopped. His hand was shaking. The last words on the page were smeared where his palm had dragged across the wet ink. Clara took the notebook from him. Read every word. Her eyes moved slowly, carefully, giving each sentence its weight. When she finished, she set the notebook aside and took both his hands in hers. She did not write anything, did not offer comfort in words, just held on, her grip firm and steady, anchoring him to the present while the past howled around them like a storm. The sun had moved across the sky by the time Elias found his voice again. Not his speaking voice that remained trapped behind the wall in his throat, but his writing hand had steadied. The tremors had faded to a faint vibration, like the last ripples spreading across a pond after a stone has sunk to the bottom. Clara still sat beside him. She had not moved except to shift her grip on his hands, adjusting when his fingers cramped from holding too tight. He pulled the notebook toward him. I don't talk about them. Ever. The folks in town don't even know I had a family. She read it and wrote back. Why? Because talking makes it real. And I have spent 12 years trying to make it not real. Did it work? He looked at the toys spread across the bed, at the ribbon and the Bible, and the lock of pale hair. No. Clara nodded slowly. Then she wrote something that made his breath catch. I do not talk about my brother either. His name was Thomas. He was 3 years older than me. He caught the fever first. I caught it from him. He died holding my hand. I did not know until I woke up a week later, and he was already in the ground. Elias read the words. Read them again. You were with him when he died, yes. But I do not remember it. The fever burned everything away. My last memory of him alive is from 3 days before, when he was teaching me to skip stones at the creek. I can still see the way his arm moved. I cannot remember his face. She paused, then added, I have tried for 15 years to remember his face. Sometimes I think I see it, but then it slips away, like water through my fingers. Elias looked at her, at this woman who carried her own ghosts, her own graves, her own chest of memories locked away in the back of her mind. You never told anyone. Who would I tell my parents sent me to the almshouse after the fever? They could not afford a deaf daughter. The women there did not want to hear about dead brothers. They had their own sorrows. How long were you there? 12 years. From 8 until 20. Then they released me because I was too old. I worked as a seamstress in Boston for 3 years. Then I saw your advertisement. Elias sat with this information. The almshouse. 12 years of institutional walls and regimented meals, and no one to talk to. Even if she could have found the words. Why did you answer it? He wrote. My advertisement. Why did you come here? Clara was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes moved to the window, where the late afternoon light painted the peaks in shades of gold and amber. Because you said you wanted someone who was not afraid of heights, she wrote finally. I thought that was honest. Most men lie in their advertisements. They say they want a companion, a helpmate, a partner. What they mean is they want a servant who will also warm their bed. You asked for someone who could handle being alone, who could survive in a hard place. You did not promise comfort or ease. You promised work and solitude and a house on a cliff. She met his eyes. I have had enough of promises that could not be kept. I wanted something true, even if it was difficult. Elias read her words 3 times. Each reading revealed another layer, another depth. And have you found it? He wrote. Something true. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached past him and picked up the wooden horse from the bed, turned it in her hands the way she had before. feeling the smooth curves and sharp edges. I found a man who carves toys for a sister who died 12 years ago, she wrote, who keeps them in a chest and cannot throw them away, who built a house in a place no one else would live, because he did not want to be found. I found someone who is afraid of the same things I am afraid of, who runs from the same ghosts. She set down the horse and looked at him. That is true enough for me? Night came slowly to the mountain. Elias built up the fire, while Clara put the toys back in the chest. She handled each one with the same care she had shown taking them out, as if they were holy relics rather than the playthings of a dead child. When she closed the lid, she did not cover it with blankets again, left it sitting in the corner, visible, acknowledged. They ate supper in silence, but it was a different silence than before, lighter somehow, as if speaking the unspeakable had lifted a weight neither of them had known they were carrying. After the plates were cleared, Clara took out her notebook. I want to show you something. She stood and went to her canvas bag, still sitting beside the bed in the back room. From inside, she withdrew a small wooden box, brought it to the table and set it between them. The box was plain, unadorned. Pine, by the look of it, with simple brass hinges. She opened it and tilted it toward him. Inside lay a collection of objects. A smooth stone, gray with a white stripe running through it, a brass button, tarnished green, a scrap of blue fabric, and a daguerreotype, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. She picked up the daguerreotype and held it out to him. The image was faded, the edges soft with age, but he could make out two children, a boy and a girl, standing stiffly in front of a wooden fence. The boy was taller, his arm around the girl's shoulders. The girl's face was turned slightly toward her brother, not quite looking at the camera. Thomas and me, Clara wrote. 3 weeks before the fever. It is the only picture I have. Elias studied the image. The boy had Clara's gray eyes, or she had his. The same serious set to the mouth. The same way of standing, weight balanced, ready to move. You look like him, he wrote. Folks used to say that. It hurt, after he died. Now I am grateful. When I look in the mirror, I see him. She took back the daguerreotype and held it for a moment, her thumb brushing across the surface. Then she placed it carefully back in the box. The stone is from the creek where he taught me to skip. The button came off his coat the day before he got sick. The fabric is from his burial shirt. My mother let me cut a piece before they closed the coffin. Elias looked at the objects. Such small things, such enormous weight. You keep these with you always. For 15 years. They are all I have left of him. She closed the box and set it aside. Then she wrote one more line. Now you have seen my chest, and I have seen yours. We are not strangers anymore. Elias sat with those words as the fire crackled and popped, sending small showers of sparks up the chimney. The wind murmured outside the walls, a low and constant sound like distant conversation. She was right. The showing of wounds had changed something between them. Strangers protected their scars. Friends or whatever they were becoming laid them bare. He reached across the table and touched her hand. A brief contact, there and gone. Thank you, he wrote, for telling me about Thomas. Thank you for telling me about Emma. They sat together as the fire burned down, not speaking, not needing to. The silence wrapped around them like a shared blanket, warm and close. When Clara finally rose to go to bed, She paused at the door to the back room. She turned and looked at him. Her gray eyes caught the dying firelight and held it. Then she did something she had never done before. She signed. Her hands moved in a pattern he did not recognize, a word or phrase, from whatever language she had learned in the soundless years of her life. The gesture was fluid, graceful, deliberate. He shook his head to show he did not understand. She smiled, just slightly, just enough. Then she went into the back room and closed the door. Elias sat alone in the darkened cabin, staring at the space where her hands had moved through the air. He had no way of knowing what she had said. The sign could have meant anything. Good night. Thank you. Something else entirely. But the way she had looked at him before she made it, the softness in her eyes, the slight curve of her lips told him it was important. A word that mattered. A word he suddenly desperately wanted to understand. The rain started at dawn. Elias woke to the sound of it hammering against the roof. A steady drumming that filled the cabin, like water filling a barrel. He pushed himself up from his bedroll and crossed to the window. The sky had turned the color of wet slate, and the peaks had vanished behind curtains of falling water. Clara emerged from the back room, already dressed. She stood beside him at the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Her hand pressed flat against the pane, feeling the vibration of each drop striking the surface. She traced a word on the fogged glass with her fingertip. Storm. He nodded. She studied his face. Whatever she saw there made her frown. She wiped the glass clean and wrote again. Bad. He took her notebook from the table and wrote properly, his letters large and clear. The rain is heavy. If it keeps up, the creek will flood. The trail might wash out. She read it and nodded, accepting the information without alarm. Then she went to the stove and began building up the fire for breakfast. Elias stayed at the window. The rain was coming from the southwest, driven by a wind that bent the treetops and sent pine needles swirling through the air. He had seen storms like this before. Most passed in a day or two, leaving mud and fallen branches, but nothing worse. But the ground was already saturated from the wet spring. The creeks were running high, and the slope below the cabin, the one that dropped 300 feet to the valley floor, was held together by tree roots and prayers. He turned from the window and began checking the cabin's defenses. The shutters first, making sure the latches were secure, then the food stores, counting jars and dried goods. Water, they had the rain barrel on the north side, which would overflow before the day was out. Clara watched him move through the cabin with quick, efficient steps. When he paused, she held out a cup of coffee, steam rising in a thin curl. He took it and drank. The heat spread through his chest, steadying him. "What do you need me to do?" she wrote. He thought for a moment. Then he led her outside. The rain hit them like a wall of cold needles. Within seconds, his shirt was soaked through, plastered against his skin. Clara's hair escaped its pins and hung in dark ropes against her face. But she did not retreat to the shelter of the porch. She followed him around the side of the cabin to where he kept his tools. The drainage channels he had dug years ago were already running full, carrying water away from the foundation. But the one on the uphill side had clogged with debris, leaves and twigs, and a dead branch that had fallen during the night. He grabbed a shovel and began to clear it. Clara took the rake without being asked and worked beside him, pulling the debris free while he deepened the channel. The work was hard. The mud sucked at their boots, and the rain blinded them, and the wind tried to push them off their feet. The smell of wet earth filled Elias's nostrils, thick and heavy, mixing with the sharper scent of broken pine needles. But they kept at it, digging and raking and clearing, until the water flowed freely again and the pressure against the cabin's foundation eased. Inside, they stripped off their wet outer clothes and hung them near the fire. Elias gave Clara one of his flannel shirts to wear while her dress dried. It hung past her knees. The sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and something about the sight of her in his clothes made his chest tighten in a way he did not want to examine. The day passed slowly. The rain did not let up. If anything, it grew heavier as the hours wore on. The drops so thick they seemed to merge into a solid sheet of falling water. Clara worked on a chair spindle she had been shaping. Elias paced. He could not sit still. Every few minutes he went to the window and looked out at the gray wall of rain, at the trees bending in the wind, at the ground that was turning to soup before his eyes. By late afternoon, the first sign of real trouble appeared. A rumble, deep and low, felt more than heard. Elias froze in the middle of the cabin, his head cocked, listening. Clara looked up from her work. She could not hear the sound, but she could see his face. She set down the spindle and rose. "What is it?" He held up a hand. "Wait." The rumble came again, longer this time, and beneath his feet, through the floorboards, he felt the cabin shudder. He grabbed his coat and went to the door. Clara followed. The rain was still falling, but through the gray curtain he could see something moving on the ridge across the valley. A dark stain spreading down the slope, carrying trees with it, like a river carries driftwood. Landslide. Not on his ridge. Not yet. But the conditions were the same. The saturated soil, the steep grade, the weight of water pressing down from above. He turned to Clara and grabbed her shoulders, making sure she could see his face clearly. "We have to go," he said, exaggerating the movement of his lips. Now. She did not ask questions, did not hesitate. She ran to the back room and emerged seconds later with her canvas bag, her wooden box tucked inside. Elias grabbed the emergency pack he kept by the door: dried food, matches, a knife, rope. He shoved the notebook and pencil into his pocket. At the front door, he paused. The porch extended over empty air. Below, the valley was invisible behind the rain. To reach the trail, they would have to cross 10 feet of open ground where the slope began its drop to the forest below. He took Clara's hand. They ran. The mud grabbed at their boots, trying to drag them down. The rain drove into their faces, blinding them. Elias kept his grip on Clara's hand so tight his knuckles ached. He could not lose her. Not here. Not now. They reached the trail, the path that wound down the mountain, the only route to safety. But the rain had turned it into a river. Brown water rushed past their ankles, carrying rocks and debris. Elias looked down the trail, looked back at the cabin. The cabin was on the ridge, built on solid granite. If they stayed inside, they might be safe. But if the slope beneath it gave way, if the supports he had drilled into the rock failed, the whole structure would drop into the void. "Shelter," he wrote on his hand, tracing the letters against his palm where Clara could see. "Other side of ridge." She nodded. They climbed. The old mine shaft was 100 yards up the slope, carved into the granite by prospectors who had given up long before Elias arrived. He had explored it once, years ago, and found it dry and stable, the rock solid, the ceiling sound. The entrance was hidden behind a screen of brush. Elias pushed through it, pulling Clara after him. The darkness inside was absolute, but it was dry. The roar of the rain faded to a muffled drumming against the mountainside. He fumbled in his pack for matches, struck one. The small flame revealed rough stone walls, a floor of packed dirt, and a ceiling high enough to stand. The air smelled of damp rock and old dust, the mineral scent of a place that had been sealed away from the world for decades. Clara's face appeared in the flickering light. Her hair hung in wet ropes around her face. Her borrowed shirt clung to her body, but her eyes were steady, calm. She took the notebook from his pocket, wet, but still usable, and wrote, "How long do we stay until the rain stops? Until the ground is stable? Hours, maybe longer." She nodded and set about making the space livable. She found a relatively dry spot against the wall and spread out the contents of her bag, a change of clothes, wrapped in oilcloth, miraculously dry. She handed him a shirt from the bundle. They changed in the darkness, the match having burned out. Elias felt the brush of her arm against his as she moved past him. The accidental contact sent a jolt through his body that had nothing to do with the cold. He struck another match and found a flat stone where he could build a small fire. The wood in his pack was damp, but the inner pieces were dry enough to catch. Soon a tiny flame was burning, casting dancing shadows on the walls. They sat side by side, their backs against the stone, watching the fire. The smoke curled upward and found its way out through cracks in the rock above, leaving the air breathable but tinged with the smell of burning pine. Clara wrote in the notebook, the pencil scratching against the damp paper. "The cabin? Will it survive?" Elias thought about the foundation he had built, the iron pins drilled into granite, the flexible joints that allowed the structure to sway without breaking. "I don't know," he wrote honestly. "I built it to last. But the ground beneath it?" He did not finish the sentence. Did not need to. Clara read his words and set down the notebook. Then she did something unexpected. She reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the rain, but her grip was strong. She held on the way a person holds on when standing at the edge of a cliff, not from fear, but from the simple need for connection. He did not pull away. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the dark ceiling. "I wanted to ask you something," Clara wrote with her free hand, the letters awkward but legible. "Last night, the sign I made." Elias nodded. He had been thinking about it all day. The graceful movement of her hands, the soft look in her eyes. What did it mean? She did not answer immediately. The fire cast her face in shades of gold and shadow. Her gray eyes seemed almost amber in the light. Finally, she wrote, "It is hard to explain in words. The sign does not translate exactly. Try." She set down the pencil and lifted her hand. Made the sign again. Slowly this time, so he could see each movement. Her hand started at her lips, then moved outward, opening as it went, like releasing a bird into the air. The closest word in English, she wrote, is cherish. But it means more than that. It means to hold something precious in your heart, to protect it, to keep it safe. Elias read the words. Read them again. You signed that to me? Yes. Why? She looked at him for a long moment. The fire had burned down to coals, and the darkness was creeping back in. Her face was half in shadow, half in light. Because you showed me Emma's things, she wrote. Because you trusted me with your grief. No one has trusted me with anything for a very long time. That deserves cherishing. To me, it does. The words sat between them, heavy with meaning. Elias felt something shifting in his chest. A door swinging open on rusty hinges. He raised his free hand, tried to copy the sign she had made. From his lips. Outward. Opening. She watched him. A smile flickered across her face. Not quite. She wrote, Here. She took his hand and guided it through the motion. The starting position against his lips. The release. The opening of his fingers at the end. Like letting go of something precious and trusting it to fly. He tried again. Better this time. She nodded. Yes, like that. He made the sign once more, looking directly at her as he did. Her breath caught. He saw it in the sudden stillness of her chest, the widening of her eyes. You mean it, she wrote. He took the pencil. I am learning to... The night passed slowly. The rain continued, but the thunder of landslides did not return. They took turns sleeping, one keeping watch while the other dozed against the cold stone wall. When Elias woke from his second sleep, the quality of light at the cave entrance had changed. Pale gray instead of black. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The air smelled cleaner now, washed by the storm, carrying the fresh scent of wet pine and new-turned earth. Clara was awake, sitting by the dead fire, her notebook in her lap. She looked up when he stirred. Morning, she wrote. The rain is stopping. He rose and went to the entrance. The world outside was transformed. The trees dripped with water. The ground was scarred with rivulets and gullies. But the sky was lightening in the east, and the clouds were beginning to break apart. He turned back to Clara. We can go back. Check the cabin. She nodded and began packing their things. The walk back took twice as long as the flight up. The trail was slick with mud, and twice Elias had to catch Clara when her feet slipped on the treacherous ground. Each time, he held her a moment longer than necessary before letting go. They rounded the final bend, and the cabin came into view. It was still there. The structure clung to the granite ledge exactly as he had built it, the logs dark with rain, the windows intact. The porch still extended over empty air. The chimney still stood straight. But the ground beneath it had changed. A section of the slope, perhaps 20 feet wide, had slid away during the night. The scar was visible from where they stood, raw earth and exposed rock where grass and trees had been. The slide had stopped just short of the granite foundation, leaving the cabin untouched but surrounded by destruction. Elias stared at the gap between the cabin and the intact ground. 10 feet of empty air where the path had been. Clara gripped his arm. She had seen it too. The cabin had survived, but they could not reach it. The only access had been swept away. They were stranded on the wrong side of a chasm, looking at a home they could see but not touch. And somewhere, in the damaged earth beneath his feet, Elias felt another tremor, small, but unmistakable. The mountain was not finished moving. The tremor passed. Elias stood at the edge of the chasm, his boots inches from the crumbling lip. The gap between them and the cabin measured 10 feet across, maybe 12. Below, the slide had carved a wound in the mountainside that dropped 40 feet before leveling out into a tangle of uprooted trees and scattered boulders. Clara tugged at his sleeve. He turned. "We cannot stay here," she wrote, the pencil shaking in her grip. "The ground is not stable." He knew. He could feel it through his boots, the subtle vibration of earth still settling, still deciding whether to hold or let go. But the cabin, everything he had built, everything he owned. "Wait here," he wrote. "I'm going to find another way across." She grabbed his arm before he could move. Her fingers dug into his flesh hard enough to bruise. "No. We go down. Together. To the town." He pulled free. The motion was rougher than he intended, and she stumbled back a step. The hurt in her eyes hit him like a fist to the stomach. "I have to try," he wrote. "The cabin." She snatched the pencil from his hand and wrote so hard the paper tore. "The cabin is wood. You are not. I did not come here to watch you die for a pile of logs." The words blurred. He blinked and realized his eyes were wet. Rain, he told himself. Just rain. But the rain had stopped an hour ago. He looked at the cabin, at the gap, at Clara, standing in the mud with her borrowed shirt and her canvas bag and her gray eyes that saw everything he tried to hide. "Okay," he wrote. "We go down." The descent was a nightmare. The trail had become a river of mud, ankle-deep in places, knee-deep in others. Every step was a gamble. Find solid ground. Test it, shift weight, pray it held. The trees that had survived the slide were slick with water, their bark peeling away under his hands when he tried to grab hold. Clara fell first. Her boot hit a buried root and her leg twisted. She went down hard, landing on her side in the black mud. It splattered across her face, into her mouth, her eyes. She coughed and spat, trying to clear the grit from her teeth. Elias reached down to help her up. The ground gave way beneath him. He felt it go, the sickening lurch of solid earth turning to liquid. His feet shot out from under him, and he landed on his back. Sliding down the slope on a wave of mud and debris, rocks tore at his shirt, ripping the fabric, scraping the skin beneath. Branches whipped his face, drawing thin lines of fire across his cheeks. The world became a spinning blur of brown and gray. He hit something solid, a boulder, half buried in the hillside. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent white fire through his ribs. He lay there, face down in the mud, unable to move, unable to breathe. The taste of dirt filled his mouth, clogged his nostrils. He tried to push himself up and his arms gave out, tried again and managed to lift his head an inch before collapsing. The mud was cold against his cheek. It smelled of rot and iron and things that had been buried too long. He could feel it seeping into his clothes, into his skin, turning him into part of the mountain he had tried so hard to tame. Clara. He could not see her, could not call out, could only lie in the muck like a broken thing, waiting for the strength to return to his limbs. A hand on his shoulder. Small, strong fingers, digging into his flesh. She rolled him onto his back. Her face appeared above him, streaked with mud, her hair matted with leaves and twigs. She was saying something, her lips moving, words he could not hear because he had never learned to read lips and she could not make sound anyway. She pulled at his arm. "Get up. Get up." He got up. The pain in his ribs was a white-hot band around his chest. Every breath sent needles through his lungs. But he got up, because she was pulling him, and because the alternative was to lie in the mud and wait for the mountain to finish what it had started. They climbed down together, slower now, more careful. Elias leaned on Clara more than he wanted to admit, more than his pride could stand. She was smaller than him by half a foot, lighter by 50 pounds, and yet she held him up, kept him moving, refused to let him stop. His boot caught on a root. He stumbled. And this time his legs would not hold. He went down on his knees in the mud, head bowed, arms trembling. Clara knelt in front of him, took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes were fierce, angry, alive. She pointed down the trail. Then she pointed at him, then at herself. Together, he nodded, drew a shaking breath, let her help him to his feet. They kept moving. The sun was setting by the time they reached the valley floor. The trail here was clearer, though still treacherous. They followed the creek downstream, toward the distant smudge of smoke that marked the town of Ridgewood. Every step sent fresh waves of pain through Elias's ribs. Every breath was a small war. Clara stopped at a fallen log and made him sit. She knelt in front of him and pulled up his shirt, her fingers probing his sides. When she touched the third rib on his left side, he flinched so hard he nearly fell off the log. Broken, she wrote. Maybe cracked. You need a doctor. No doctor in Ridgewood, he wrote back. His handwriting was a mess, jagged, uneven. The letters running together, just the barber. And the horse doctor. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she tore a strip from the bottom of her borrowed shirt and began to wrap it around his torso, binding the ribs as tightly as she could. The pressure hurt worse than anything. But when she finished, the grinding sensation in his chest had eased. Can you walk? Yes. He was lying. She knew he was lying, but she helped him to his feet anyway, and they kept moving. They reached Ridgewood after dark. The town was quiet. Most of the buildings shuttered against the storm damage. A few lights burned in windows, casting yellow rectangles onto the muddy street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The mud in the main street was churned and rutted from wagon wheels. Clara led him to the general store, the only building with a light in the window. She pounded on the door with her fist. Hoskins opened it, his face annoyed until he saw the state of them. His mouth fell open. Lord Almighty, what happened to you? Elias tried to speak. His voice came out as a croak. Clara pushed past Hoskins into the store. She grabbed the notebook from Elias's pocket and wrote rapidly, shoving the paper at the merchant. Landslide. Trail washed out. He has broken ribs. We need shelter. Hoskins read the note, looked at Elias, looked back at Clara. The deaf one, he said, as if she could not read his lips. Pete said she was... Clara snatched the paper back and wrote again. She is standing right here, and she kept this man alive for 6 hours in the mud. Where can we sleep? Hoskins had the grace to look ashamed. He stepped aside and waved them in. Back room. There's a cot. Not much, but it's dry. Clara helped Elias to the back. The room was cramped and dusty, filled with crates and barrels and the smell of sawdust and old coffee beans. The cot was narrow, barely big enough for one person. She eased him down onto it, his ribs screaming with every movement. Hoskins appeared in the doorway with a lantern and a bottle. Whiskey, he said, for the pain. Clara took the bottle and poured a measure into a tin cup. She held it to Elias's lips and made him drink. The liquor burned going down, but the heat spread through his chest and dulled the sharp edges of the pain. She sat on the floor beside the cot, her back against a crate of flour. Her legs stretched out, muddy boots and all. Hoskins lingered in the doorway. "Storm was bad up your way, I hear. Tom Jenkins said the whole ridge looked ready to come down." Elias closed his eyes. He did not want to think about the ridge, about the cabin, about everything he might have lost. "You two married?" Hoskins asked. The question was directed at Elias. As if Clara was not there, Clara stood up. She crossed to the doorway and positioned herself directly in front of Hoskins, close enough that he had to look at her. She wrote on the notebook and held it up to his face. "Ask me, not him. I am the one who is deaf, not invisible." Hoskins's face reddened. He took a step back. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. You have been talking around me since we arrived. As if I cannot understand. As if I am simple. Lady, I am not simple. I cannot hear. There is a difference. Now please leave and let this man rest." She closed the door in his face. Elias watched her from the cot. The anger was still written across her body, the rigid set of her shoulders, the tight clench of her jaw. But beneath it, he saw something else. The old, familiar weight of being treated as less than human. She had carried him down a mountain, had bound his ribs and kept him moving when all he wanted was to lie down and stop. And Hoskins had looked right through her, as if she was furniture. Clara. She turned at the sound of the pencil scratching against paper. "You should not have to defend yourself. Not to folks like him." She read the words, and her shoulders dropped. The anger drained out of her, leaving only exhaustion. "I have been defending myself my whole life," she wrote. "The almshouse, the factories, the streets of Boston, everywhere I go. Folks see the deafness first, the person second. If they see the person at all, I see you." She looked at him. The lantern light caught the wetness in her eyes. "Do you?" "Yes. I see a woman who dragged me down a mountain with cracked ribs, who wrapped my wounds with her own shirt, who stood up to a man twice her size because he was rude." He paused, then added, "I see the bravest person I have ever known." She read the words, read them again. Then she sat down on the edge of the cot, her hip against his, and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook. No sound came, it never did, but he could see the sobs moving through her body. Silent tears for silent pain. He reached up, ignoring the fire in his ribs, and put his hand on the back of her neck. Just held it there, feeling her shake, letting her know she was not alone. The night stretched on. Clara slept eventually, curled on the floor beside the cot with a horse blanket Hoskins had grudgingly provided. Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling around them. His ribs throbbed with every breath. His body was a map of bruises and scrapes, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. The cabin, 7 years of work, every log hand-hewn, every joint hand-cut, the foundation he had drilled into solid granite, the iron pins he had pounded into place, the flexible joints that let the structure breathe with the mountain. Gone. Maybe. Taken by the same earth he had tried to tame. He thought about the chest in the corner, Emma's toys, the wooden horse and the cloth doll and the lock of pale hair. If the cabin had fallen, they had fallen with it. The thought made something crack inside him. Not his ribs, something deeper, something that had held together through 12 years of grief and 7 years of isolation. He had lost his family to the fever, had lost 3 women who came and went like seasons, had lost the ability to trust, to hope, to believe that anything built by human hands could last. And now this, the mountain itself turning against him. Clara stirred on the floor. Her hand reached out in sleep and found his, dangling over the edge of the cot. Her fingers wrapped around his and held on. He held back. She was still here. That was something. That was more than something. But in the morning, when the sun came up and the mud dried and the damage could be assessed, what then? Would she stay with a man who had nothing, who had gambled everything on a house in the sky and lost? He had seen the way she looked at the cabin when they first arrived, the way her hands had traced the joints, feeling the craft in every cut. She had fallen in love with that house, with what it represented, with the man who could build such a thing. What was left of that man now? A broken body on a borrowed cot, covered in mud, smelling of sweat and dirt and failure, unable to stand without help. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow. He would face tomorrow when it came. But the question would not let him sleep. If the cabin is gone, will she stay? Or would she become the 4th woman to leave? Just like all the others, not because of what she saw, but because of what was no longer there to see. Morning light crept through the cracks in the storage room walls. Elias opened his eyes to the smell of dust and old flour. His ribs ached with a dull, persistent throb that flared into sharp pain when he tried to sit up. He fell back onto the cot, breathing through his teeth. Clara was not on the floor. The horse blanket lay folded neatly beside the cot. Her canvas bag was gone. Her boots were gone. He pushed himself up, ignoring the fire in his chest. The room spun. He grabbed the edge of a crate and held on until the world stopped tilting. She left. The thought hit him like a second landslide. Of course she left. What reason did she have to stay? The cabin was gone, or as good as gone. The man who had built it was broken and useless. She had done her duty, dragged him down the mountain, kept him alive, and now she was free. He made it to the door, pushed it open. Clara stood at the front counter of the general store, her back to him. Hoskins was behind the counter, wrapping something in brown paper. The merchant's face was different than it had been the night before. Subdued, almost respectful. Clara turned. She was holding a bundle of supplies. Rope, bandages, tinned food, a new notebook, the leather cover still shiny. "You're awake," she wrote on the old notebook. The pages wrinkled from yesterday's mud. "How are the ribs?" He stared at her, at the supplies in her arms, at the question that seemed so ordinary, so casual, as if nothing had changed. "I thought you left," he wrote. She frowned. "Left where the cabin is up the mountain? You are here? Where would I go?" He did not have an answer. She crossed to him and pressed her palm against his forehead, checking for fever. Her hand was cool and dry, steady. "You need to eat," she wrote, "and then we need to talk." They sat in the back room, the door closed against Hoskins's curious ears. Clara had bought bread and cheese and dried beef with money from her own pocket, the $2 silver he had given her for the chair. She spread the food on a cloth and made him eat, watching to ensure he finished every bite. When the meal was done, she took out the new notebook. "I went up the mountain this morning," she wrote, "before dawn, while you were sleeping." Elias felt his heart stutter. "You did what I had to see. I could not wait." "Clara, the ground is unstable. You could have been killed. I was careful. And I needed to know." She paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. Then she continued, "The cabin is still standing." The words blurred. He blinked hard, forcing them into focus. "Still standing, yes. The gap is there, maybe 15 feet across now. The slide took more during the night, but the cabin itself did not move. Your foundation held." Elias sat back against the crate behind him. His ribs protested, but he barely noticed. The foundation held. I could see through the windows. Everything inside looks the same. The table, the stove, the chest in the back room. The chest. Emma's things. Still there. Something broke loose in his chest. Not his ribs, but something older. Something that had been clenched tight for 12 years. He felt it released and suddenly he could not breathe for a different reason. Clara watched his face. Whatever she saw there made her set down the notebook and move to sit beside him on the cot. She did not touch him, just sat close, her shoulder against his, her warmth bleeding into his side. He reached for the notebook. "I thought I lost everything," he wrote. Again, "I thought the mountain had taken it all." "The mountain took the path," she answered. "Not the home. There is a difference. Can it be rebuilt? The path, I reckon so. The granite shelf is still solid. It would take time, materials, but yes, it can be rebuilt." He looked at her, at this woman who had climbed a dangerous mountain in the dark to bring him news she knew he needed, who had spent her own money on supplies, who sat beside him now, patient as stone, waiting for him to find his words. Why he wrote? She tilted her head. Why what? Why did you go up there? Why did you buy these supplies? Why are you still here? She took the pencil from his hand. "Because I made a choice," she wrote. "When I answered your advertisement, when I stayed that first night, when I held your hand in the mine shaft, I chose this life, this place, this man. The mountain did not change that. A gap in the trail did not change that. You are still the man who built that house. The fact that you cannot reach it right now does not make you less." Elias read her words. Read them again. The tightness in his chest was not pain anymore, or not only pain. It was something else, something that swelled and pressed against his cracked ribs from the inside. "I don't deserve you," he wrote. She read it and shook her head, took the pencil back. "That is not for you to decide. I chose. That is enough. That is." The next 3 days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Elias's ribs healed slowly. The binding Clara had made held them in place. And the pain faded from sharp to dull to merely uncomfortable. He could walk without help by the second day. By the third, he could lift light objects without gasping. Clara spent the time gathering what they needed. Rope from Hoskins purchased, not borrowed. Lumber from the mill outside town. Tools Elias had left in the shed at the base of the mountain, untouched by the slide. She also did something else. On the second evening, she sat him down at the table in the back room and opened the new notebook to a fresh page. "I want to teach you," she wrote. "Teach me what? To sign. The way I speak with my hands. So we do not always need paper. Elias looked at her hands. The hands that had swung an axe and shaped spindles and bound his broken ribs. The hands that spoke a language he did not know. Yes. He wrote, "Teach me." She started with simple things. The signs for common words. Yes. No. Water. Food. Sleep. She guided his hands through each motion, adjusting his fingers, correcting his angles. Good. She signed when he got one right. And then showed him the sign for good so he could recognize it. By the end of the first lesson, he knew 20 words. By the end of the second, 50. His hands were clumsy, the motions awkward. But she did not laugh, did not show frustration, just repeated each sign until he could make it correctly. On the third night, she taught him something different. "I want to show you the sign I made that first evening," she wrote. "The one that means cherish. But there is another sign that goes with it." She lifted her hands and made 2 motions in sequence. The first was the sign he already knew from the lips. Outward. Opening. Cherish. The second was new. Both hands pressed together over the heart, then opening outward toward him. "What does that one mean?" he wrote. She hesitated. Then she wrote, "It means I give you my heart." Together, the 2 signs mean I cherish you with all that I am. Elias stared at the words, at her hands, still held in the final position of the sign, at her face, calm on the surface, but with something trembling beneath. He raised his own hands, made the first sign, cherish. Then he tried the second, hands together over his heart, opening toward her. Her breath caught. He saw it in the sudden stillness of her chest, the widening of her eyes. "You mean it," she wrote. The same question she had asked in the mine shaft. He did not reach for the pencil. Instead, he made the signs again. Slower, more deliberate. Looking directly into her eyes, cherish, I give you my heart. She closed the distance between them. Her hands cupped his face, tilting it toward hers. And then she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss, not tentative. It was the kiss of a woman who had waited 15 years to be seen, to be chosen, to be wanted for who she was rather than despite what she lacked. His ribs screamed. He did not care. He kissed her back. The morning of the 4th day, they began the climb. Clara carried the lighter supplies rope, tools, the food she had bought. Elias carried the lumber, strapped to his back in a makeshift harness that distributed the weight away from his healing ribs. The trail was still treacherous. Mud had dried into uneven ruts, and fallen branches blocked the path every few hundred yards. But the sky was clear, the ground was stable, and they moved with purpose. They reached the gap by midday. The chasm looked different in daylight, wider than Elias had remembered, the edges crumbling and raw. But the cabin on the other side stood solid, its windows catching the sun, its porch still extending over the void. Elias studied the gap, 15 feet, too far to jump. But the granite on both sides was sound. He could see the marks where his original trail had been anchored before the slide. "We build a bridge," he wrote in the notebook. Clara nodded. She had already guessed his plan. They worked through the afternoon. Elias cut notches into the granite on their side of the gap. Using the hammer and chisel he had brought, Clara measured and cut the lumber to length. The first beam went across by late afternoon, a single plank, too narrow to walk on, but enough to string the ropes that would hold the rest. By sunset, the skeleton of a bridge stretched across the chasm. Two main beams, lashed together with rope, with cross planks waiting to be nailed in place. Tomorrow, Elias wrote, "We finish it tomorrow." They made camp on the trail side of the gap. A small fire, built in a ring of stones, dried beef and hard biscuits for supper. The stars emerging one by one as the sky darkened. The smell of wood smoke and pine resin filled the air, mixing with the clean scent of the night. Clara sat close to him, her head against his shoulder. He could feel her breathing slow, steady, content. He took out the notebook. "When the bridge is done," he wrote, "and we are back in the cabin, there is something I want to ask you." She lifted her head. "What I will tell you tomorrow, when we are home." She studied his face in the firelight. Then she smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed her features, and signed two words he had learned to recognize. "I wait." Sleep came slowly. Elias lay on his bedroll, staring up at the stars through the gap in the trees. Clara slept beside him, her hand resting on his chest, rising and falling with his breath. Tomorrow they would finish the bridge. Tomorrow they would cross back to the cabin. Tomorrow he would ask her the question that had been building inside him since the night in the mine shaft. He had never thought he would ask that question again. Had buried it along with his family, along with his hopes, along with the man he used to be. But Clara had dug it up, had brushed away the dirt, and held it up to the light, and shown him it was still alive. "Will you stay? Not just for now. Not just until the next storm, the next disaster, the next reason to leave. Forever." The word felt strange in his mind. Foreign. He had not believed in forever for a very long time. But lying here, under the stars, with her hand on his chest and the half-built bridge stretching toward their home, he was starting to believe again. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow. Everything would change tomorrow. The bridge held. Elias tested it first, placing one boot on the cross planks, then the other. The ropes creaked. The beams shifted a quarter inch, settling into their notches, but the structure did not sway, did not groan, did not give any sign of failing. He walked across slowly, feeling each plank beneath his feet. The gap yawned below him, 40 feet of empty air and tumbled rock, but he did not look down. He kept his eyes on the cabin ahead, on the porch that jutted out over the void, on the home he had built with his own hands. The last plank, the solid granite of the ledge. He stepped off the bridge and turned. Clara stood on the other side, her canvas bag over her shoulder, her face unreadable in the morning light. He held out his hand. She did not hesitate. Her boots hit the first plank, then the second, then the third. She crossed without looking down, without slowing, without any sign of the fear that had driven 3 other women away from this place. When she reached him, she took his hand and stepped onto the ledge. They stood together at the edge of the gap, looking back at the bridge they had built. 2 beams and 20 planks, lashed with rope, spanning the wound the mountain had carved. It was rough work, functional, not beautiful, but it would hold until he could build something better. Clara squeezed his hand. "Home," she signed. "Home." He signed back. The cabin was exactly as they had left it. The table stood in the center of the main room. 2 chairs pushed neatly against its edges. The stove held the ashes of their last fire, cold and gray. The windows were intact, letting in shafts of light that caught the dust motes floating in the still air. The smell of cedar and cold ash greeted them, familiar and grounding. Clara walked through the rooms slowly, touching everything. The walls, the window frames, the joints where timber met timber. Her fingers traced the same paths they had traced on her first day here, reading the cabin like a book she had memorized and returned to after a long absence. Elias followed her to the back room. The chest sat in the corner, undisturbed. He knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Emma's toys lay inside, exactly as Clara had placed them. The wooden horse, the cloth doll, the ribbon and the Bible, and the lock of pale hair. He closed the lid and stood. Clara was watching him from the doorway. "They are safe," she wrote. "Yes, I am glad." He crossed to her and took her hands in his. The calluses on her palms matched the calluses on his own, now marks of the work they had done together, the life they were building together. "There is something I want to ask you," he wrote. "I said I would ask when we were home. We are home." She waited, patient as always. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. A ring, carved from apple wood, polished until it gleamed. He had made it during the long hours in the storage room at Hoskins's store, whittling by lamplight while she slept. Clara's eyes went wide. "I am not a man of many words," he wrote, "even on paper. But I know what I want. I want you. Not just for now. Not just until the next storm. Forever." She stared at the ring, at him, at the ring again. "Will you stay?" he wrote. "As my wife." The silence stretched. The cabin held its breath. Then Clara took the ring from his palm and slid it onto her finger. The wood was warm against her skin, smooth and light. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with tears that did not fall. Her hands lifted. The signs came slowly, deliberately, each motion precise. "Yes, I stay. Forever." The wedding was small. Reverend Whitmore made the climb 2 weeks later, huffing and red-faced by the time he reached the new bridge. He was a large man, built for comfort rather than mountain trails, and he looked at the cabin with something between awe and alarm. "You live here?" he asked, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief. "On purpose?" "Yes," Elias said. The Reverend shook his head and opened his Bible. They stood on the porch. The valley spread out below them like a green ocean. Clara wore a dress she had made herself blue calico, the color of a summer sky, sewn on the small hand loom she had brought in her canvas bag. Her hair was loose, falling past her shoulders, and a crown of wild flowers sat on her head. The flowers smelled of honey and sunshine, their petals bright against her dark hair. Elias wore his cleanest shirt and his least patched trousers. His boots were polished for the first time in years. The wooden ring on his own finger matched the one on Clara's. The Reverend spoke the words. Elias repeated them, facing Clara, making sure she could see his lips. Elias Harwick, take thee, Clara, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. Clara watched his mouth form each word. When he finished, she lifted her hands and signed her own vows, the ones she had written out for the Reverend the night before, translated into the language that was truly hers. I choose you. I chose you when I stepped off the train, when I climbed into your wagon, when I saw this house and understood what kind of man could build it. I choose you now, not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because you see me, the real me, the deaf woman who learned to survive in a world that never wanted her. You built this house for yourself, but you made room for me. You let me in. I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that room. The Reverend, who could not understand the signs, waited until her hands fell still. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Elias cupped Clara's face in his hands and kissed her. The valley stretched out below them, endless and green. The wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere far away, a hawk cried once and soared higher into the blue. When they broke apart, the Reverend was already packing his Bible, eager to begin the descent, before the afternoon shadows grew too long. Mighty fine spot you've got here, he said, his tone suggesting he meant the opposite. Mighty fine indeed. Clara smiled and pressed a small bundle into his hands, bread and cheese and dried apples for the journey down. He took it with genuine gratitude and tipped his hat. May the Lord bless you both, he said. You'll need it. Living up here. They watched him cross the bridge and disappear into the trees below. Then they were alone. The seasons turned. Autumn came with gold and crimson, the aspen trees on the far ridge blazing like torches against the dark green of the pines. Elias felled timber and shaped it into furniture that Clara helped him finish. They sold 4 chairs and a table to Hoskins, who had learned to speak directly to Clara and wait for her written replies. The merchant had changed since the night of the storm. He no longer talked around her or over her. He asked her questions and waited for her answers. When other customers made comments about the deaf woman, Hoskins told them in no uncertain terms that she had made half the furniture in his store and could outwork most men he knew. The first hard frost arrived in November. Elias reinforced the bridge with additional supports, anchoring each beam more securely into the granite. Clara preserved vegetables from the garden she had planted in the spring, beans and carrots and potatoes. Stored in the root cellar, Elias dug into the hillside behind the cabin. On the coldest nights, they sat together by the fire, teaching and learning. Elias's signing improved week by week. He could hold simple conversations now, his hands forming words that had once seemed impossible. Clara taught him new signs each evening, words for the things around them, for the emotions inside them, for the life they were building together. Fire, she would sign, pointing to the flames. Fire, he would sign back. Warm, warm, love. His hands would pause. Then he would make the sign, both hands crossed over his heart, then opening toward her, and mean it more deeply each time. On Sunday mornings, before the work began, Clara would sit by the window with Emma's Bible in her lap. She could not hear the hymns that other folks sang in churches down below, but she read the Psalms silently, her lips moving with the words. Sometimes Elias sat beside her, reading over her shoulder, finding comfort in the familiar verses his mother had taught him as a boy. They did not speak of it, did not need to. Faith, like love, did not always require words. The letter arrived in early December. Hoskins sent it up with a supply delivery, tucked among the flour and salt and coffee beans. Clara found it first, saw the return address, and brought it to Elias with a question in her eyes. He did not recognize the handwriting. The postmark was from Boston. He opened it and read, "Dear Mr. Harwick, I am writing to inform you that your advertisement continues to generate interest, despite the notice you sent requesting its removal. Several women have written to our office inquiring about your situation. If you wish to renew the listing, please send the enclosed fee. If your circumstances have changed, please confirm and we will cease publication immediately. Respectfully yours." The Matrimonial Gazette. Elias read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Clara. She read it slowly, her face expressionless. When she finished, she looked at him. "Your circumstances," she wrote in the notebook. "Have they changed?" He took the pencil. "Yes." "Completely." "What will you tell them?" He thought for a moment. Then he wrote his reply on the back of the letter itself, in letters large enough for a clerk to read without squinting. "Dear Sir, please cancel my advertisement immediately. I have found what I was looking for, Kata. My circumstances have changed. In the following ways I am no longer alone. I am no longer afraid. I have a wife who makes chairs with her own hands, who climbs mountains without fear, who speaks a language more beautiful than any words I have ever heard. I do not need your services. I do not need anything but what I already have. Regards, Elias Harwick." He showed the letter to Clara. She read it, and her lips curved into that rare, full smile. "You are sure she signed?" "I have never been more sure of anything." She took the letter and folded it carefully. Then she walked to the stove, opened the firebox door, and dropped it into the flames. They watched it burn together, the paper curling and blackening, the words turning to ash and smoke. When it was gone, Clara turned to face him. "Home," she signed. "Home," he signed back. The sun set behind the mountains. Elias stood on the porch of the cabin he had built, watching the sky turn from gold to rose to deep purple. The valley below was already in shadow, the treetops dark and still. The first stars were emerging, faint points of light in the deepening blue. Clara came to stand beside him. She slipped her hand into his, her fingers warm against his palm. They did not speak, did not need to. The silence between them was not empty, it was full of everything they had shared, everything they had survived, everything they were still building together. The cabin stood solid behind them, anchored to the granite, flexing with the wind but never breaking. The bridge stretched across the gap to the trail beyond, connecting them to the world below without binding them to it. And the mountains rose all around, ancient and patient, witnesses to a love that had grown in the most unlikely of places. Elias raised his free hand and signed the words that had become their nightly ritual. "I cherish you." Clara signed back, "I cherish you." Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the stars emerge together. Two people who had learned that home was not a place you found, but a place you built timber by timber, word by word, silence by silence. The wind whispered through the pines. The cabin creaked and settled, the familiar sounds of a house breathing. And far below, in the valley where the creek ran silver in the starlight. An owl called once and was answered by its mate. Clara could not hear it, but she felt Elias's hand tighten on hers. And she knew the way she always knew that something beautiful had just happened in the world beyond her silence. She smiled, and the night wrapped around them, soft and deep, holding them safe in the home they had made together on the edge of the sky. Friend, I want to share something with you before we part ways. This story of Elias and Clara the lumberjack who built his house where no one else would live, and the deaf woman who saw past the strangeness to the man beneath it, reminds me of something my grandmother used to say. She would sit on her porch in the evening light, hands busy with her mending, and she would tell me that the loneliest folks often have the biggest hearts. They just need someone patient enough to find the door. I think about Clara climbing that mountain in the dark, not knowing if the cabin still stood. I think about Elias carving a ring from apple wood while his ribs were still healing. These are not grand gestures. They are small acts of faith, repeated until they become something unbreakable. That is what love is. I reckon. Not the lightning bolt, not the earthquake, just two people choosing each other, day after day, even when choosing is hard. If you have someone in your life who has chosen you through the storms and the landslides and the long silences, hold on to them. Tell them what they mean to you. Do not wait for the perfect moment. The moment is now. And if you are still waiting for your person, do not lose hope. Sometimes love arrives on a dusty train platform, carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a heart full of questions. Sometimes it speaks a language you do not yet understand. Keep your door open. Keep your heart soft. The right person will find their way to you. Thank you for walking this road with me. Until we meet again on another trail, another story, another evening by the fire. Your friend in tales and truths. This story is inspired by the tradition of Western frontier tales and mail-order bride narratives, created solely for entertainment purposes. This narrative does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters, names, and events depicted are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. The themes explored herein celebrate resilience, human connection, and the quiet courage of ordinary people finding their place in the world.